Imagine this. It's the 1950s, a decade defined by slick fedoras, the constant haze of cigarette smoke, and the quiet murmurings of espionage that were as much a part of daily life as the morning papers. The world is on the edge, caught in the icy grip of the Cold War, where fear of the unknown and the specter of a nuclear threat loom large in every conversation. The streets of San Francisco pulse with a gritty charm, a city of contrasts where the old meets the new. But tonight, the usual hum of life feels different, like something unseen is watching. You stroll down a side street, the faint scent of sea air mingling with the urban grit. A neon sign catches your eye, a promise of a good time, with a seductive glow that draws you in. The kind of place where secrets are whispered, and the night holds 1,000 possibilities. You push open the door, stepping into the dim, smoky interior. The chatter of other patrons blends with jazz music that seems to float through the air, creating a scene both familiar and enticing. Yet, as your eyes adjust to the shadows, something doesn't feel quite right. There's a strange sense of being watched, but you brush it off. It's just the night's allure, you think. You don't realize it yet, but you're not just another customer in this dingy bar. You're part of something far darker, far more twisted. Behind hidden walls, men in sharp suits monitor your every move, their faces obscured behind one-way mirrors. Clipboards in hand, they observe, taking notes on every shift in your demeanor. These aren't just curious onlookers, they're intelligence agents, part of an operation so secret, so bizarre, that you couldn't begin to comprehend the true nature of what's unfolding around you. As the bartender slides you a drink, you feel a brief sense of unease, an odd flicker of doubt, but it's fleeting. You raise the glass to your lips, unaware that what you're about to consume is not just alcohol. No, tonight, you've been selected for an experiment. The drink is laced with a substance you've never heard of, a mind-altering drug that's still in its infancy. LSD. You take a sip, and suddenly the room seems to tilt, the walls blurring as the very fabric of reality begins to shift in ways you can't explain. Your senses betray you, the world around you slipping into something surreal. Welcome to Operation Midnight Climax, one of the most controversial and disturbing covert programs ever conducted by the CIA. It's a twisted mix of espionage, psychological manipulation, and mind control experiments using unsuspecting citizens as human guinea pigs. The very thought of it sounds like the plot of a dark, noir thriller, a world where nothing is as it seems, and everyone has a secret. But the truth, it's far darker than fiction. As the effects of the drug begin to take hold, you're no longer sure what's real or imagined. The laughter of others feels distant, like it's coming from a place you can't reach. You're disoriented, vulnerable, and unaware that you are part of an experiment designed to test the boundaries of human consciousness, a test that stretches the very limits of ethics and humanity. And the worst part? You are not alone. The agency has done this to countless others, all for a single sinister goal: to unlock the secrets of mind control. What you don't know yet is that this isn't just a test of LSD, it's part of a much bigger operation, one with global implications. The men behind the glass aren't just observers, they're shaping the future of psychological warfare. As the drug pulls you deeper into the unknown, you will never fully understand what's happening to you or why. But you will remember this night. In the years to come, as the secrets of Operation Midnight Climax begin to leak out, you'll realize that your role was far more than that of a hapless patron. You were a part of history, a brief, terrified participant in one of the most unethical and dangerous experiments ever run by the CIA. And the truth? It's a story too twisted, too raw to remain hidden forever. As the doors of this dark chapter begin to open, the shocking truth of what happened behind the walls of those safe houses will come into the light. The time for silence is over, and the secrets of Operation Midnight Climax are about to be revealed. Hello, truth seekers, and welcome back to Secrets Unleashed, the show where we tear back the curtain on the stories they never wanted you to hear. I'm your narrator, your guide into the hidden corridors of history, where shadows linger and secrets rot beneath the surface. If this is your first time here, buckle up. And if you're a returning listener, you already know the drill. Every episode, we peel away the layers of silence to expose the truth buried underneath decades of lies. Today's story, it's one of the most disturbing tales we've ever covered. This week, we're diving headfirst into the bizarre and deeply unsettling world of Operation Midnight Climax, a CIA experiment so outrageous, it sounds like the plot of a dystopian thriller. But this isn't fiction. It happened, and it happened right here in America. Imagine walking into what seems like an ordinary apartment in San Francisco or New York in the 1950s. You're looking for a good time, maybe a drink, some company. Instead, you're being watched through a two-way mirror, dosed with LSD without your knowledge, and observed like a lab rat while government agents take notes. This was not a one-off event. It was a calculated, decade-long operation conducted by the United States Central Intelligence Agency. And the craziest part? Many of the people involved didn't even know they were part of an experiment. Operation Midnight Climax wasn't just an extension of the infamous MKULTRA project. It was its unholy offspring. At the heart of it was a single, sinister question. Can you control someone's mind without their consent? The CIA was obsessed with this possibility. They believed psychedelics, especially LSD, might be the key to unlocking the subconscious and turning people into programmable tools for espionage, interrogation, or even assassination. What resulted was a grotesque experiment on the American public conducted without permission, without oversight, and without remorse. We'll be telling this story in the style we know best. A slow-burn, true crime saga that isn't afraid to ask uncomfortable questions. This isn't just about spy games or Cold War paranoia. It's about real people, ordinary citizens, who were unknowingly thrust into a government nightmare. People who never signed up to be test subjects. People who suffered breakdowns, confusion, and in some cases, devastating consequences. Who gave the green light for this madness? What kind of people thought it was acceptable to use brothels and bars as labs for psychological warfare? And more importantly, what does it say about a government that secretly drugged its own people in pursuit of control? In this episode, we're going to explore the full scope of Operation Midnight Climax. From its bizarre origins, to the rogue agents who ran it, to the shattered lives it left behind. We'll confront the ethical abyss that lies at the heart of covert experimentation, and we'll look at the ripple effects still felt today. So settle in for a long, disturbing, and eye-opening journey 10,000 words deep into one of the strangest and most chilling chapters in American history. Let's begin. To truly understand Operation Midnight Climax, we need to rewind to the 1950s, a time when the world felt like it was teetering on the edge of disaster. The Cold War had descended upon the planet, like a dark, looming storm cloud, thick, ominous, and impossible to ignore. The global superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, were locked in an ideological battle that had spilled over into nearly every facet of life. It wasn't just a war of weapons or territorial control. It was a war for the mind. The goal wasn't just to win battles on the ground. It was to dominate the very thoughts and beliefs of individuals, to twist reality itself, to reshape entire societies in the image of one ideology or the other. This was the world that Operation Midnight Climax was born into. The CIA and its counterparts across the globe were obsessed with psychological warfare. They understood that in the age of nuclear weapons, the true threat wasn't just about firepower, it was about influence, control, and the ability to manipulate populations from the inside. Fear was the currency of the time. Spies whispered in back alleys, governments hoarded secrets, and ordinary citizens were encouraged to view each other with suspicion. Paranoia was at an all-time high. The media was filled with stories of communist infiltrators within the United States. The concept of brainwashing had taken hold, fueled by alarming reports that American prisoners of war returning from Korea were reciting communist propaganda, triggering panic across the nation. Had they been converted? Or had their minds been hijacked, reprogrammed like machines? The implications were chilling. And so, the CIA began to focus more heavily on the idea of controlling the mind, of breaking down human resistance to interrogation, of finding ways to extract secrets without the use of traditional torture. The concept of mind control became the CIA's obsession, and from that obsession, MKULTRA was born. Launched in 1953 under the direction of CIA chemist Sidney Gottlieb, MKULTRA was the umbrella for a vast number of sub-projects, each dedicated to the goal of controlling the human mind. The agency explored every possible method: hypnosis, sensory deprivation, electroshock therapy, forced drug addiction, and a host of other experimental techniques, all in the name of scientific research. But one particular operation would stand out in its sheer audacity and moral bankruptcy: Operation Midnight Climax. The name itself sounds like something out of a cheap pulp novel or a seedy crime flick, but the reality was far darker. Operation Midnight Climax was not conducted in faraway war zones or behind enemy lines. It was carried out right in the heart of American cities, specifically San Francisco and later, New York. The CIA had leased several apartments and converted them into what appeared to be upscale bordellos. These were not just brothels, they were carefully crafted safe houses where the agency could conduct its bizarre experiments on unsuspecting men. Sidney Gottlieb, the man behind MKULTRA, was far from your typical bureaucrat. Described by some as a mad scientist, Gottlieb was an eccentric figure who practiced yoga, meditated, and spent weekends living off the grid. But his unorthodox lifestyle masked a brilliant and disturbing mind. As head of MKULTRA, Gottlieb held nearly unchecked power. His job was simple: explore mind control by any means necessary. The stakes were high, and Gottlieb believed the ends justified the means. When he heard about LSD, a newly discovered psychoactive drug, his imagination exploded with possibilities. Could LSD be used as a tool of control? Could it be a truth serum, an interrogation enhancer, or perhaps even a way to reprogram the human brain? These were the kinds of questions that Gottlieb was determined to answer. At the time, LSD was still largely a mystery. It had been synthesized in the 1930s by Swiss chemist Albert Hofmann, but its powerful psychoactive properties weren't fully understood until the 1950s, when scientists began to realize its mind-altering effects. The CIA saw potential in LSD beyond just therapeutic use. Could they use it as a tool for espionage? Could it be used to manipulate minds in such a way that individuals would become unwitting pawns? This was the beginning of the CIA's experimentation with LSD, which would later become the hallmark of Operation Midnight Climax. But laboratory testing wasn't providing the results Gottlieb and the CIA were hoping for. The controlled environment of a laboratory was too predictable. The subjects were too cautious, too aware of their surroundings. The real world, with its unpredictability, seemed like the better testing ground. So the CIA turned to George Hunter White, a former narcotics officer who had transitioned into a CIA asset. White was known for his flamboyant, brash personality and his willingness to break rules. He was a man of the underworld, familiar with criminals, vice, and manipulation, and he was the perfect person to run the safe houses that would become the foundation of Operation Midnight Climax. White's role was simple. He would operate the safe houses and oversee the experiments, ensuring they ran smoothly. The CIA provided everything from the rent, to the furnishings, to the prostitutes who would lure unsuspecting men into the apartments. These women, often working with the CIA, would spike the drinks of their guests with LSD, unaware of the twisted purpose behind the interaction. The men, mostly businessmen, sailors, drifters, and petty criminals, had no idea they were part of a government experiment. They were simply looking for a night of fun or companionship, and instead, they would become unwilling participants in a psychological experiment. Once the drug took effect, the women would step aside, and White would observe the men through one-way mirrors. He would watch as they wandered, confused and terrified, often muttering incoherently or revealing personal secrets. Sometimes, the women would try to coax more information out of them. Other times, White simply watched in silent amusement as the men unraveled under the influence of LSD. The experiments were filmed, documented, and sent back to the CIA. But there was no real scientific rigor to the process. No control groups, no consent, and certainly no ethical oversight. The agency's sole focus was on obtaining data, regardless of the human cost. The safe houses were lavishly decorated, creating a surreal atmosphere. The rooms were furnished with leopard print rugs, framed erotic art, and hidden cameras, and microphones were embedded in light fixtures. LSD was stored in liquor bottles and perfume atomizers, a subtle method of spiking the drinks of unsuspecting men. White, who lived a double life as both a respected government official and a CIA contractor, took copious notes detailing the episodes in crude, gleeful detail. He seemed to enjoy the power and control he held over these men, enjoying the sense of invincibility that came with his position. These were not experiments conducted with the goal of advancing science. They were operations designed to test the limits of human control, to see how far the CIA could go before someone noticed. The men being experimented on were often victims of circumstance people who would never be missed, whose lives were disposable. They had no idea they were part of a government-sponsored psychological experiment, and for many, the aftermath would be just as brutal as the experiments themselves. Over time, the CIA escalated the experiments, administering LSD repeatedly over long stretches. They mixed other drugs into the equation: barbiturates, amphetamines, and mescaline, to see how these chemicals would interact with the brain. They experimented with sensory manipulation, loud noises, flashing lights, isolation, and sleep deprivation. They even explored psychological techniques like humiliation and emotional breakdown. The results were chaotic, cruel, and ultimately ineffective. The CIA had poured millions of dollars into these experiments, but there were no breakthroughs in mind control, no definitive ways to manipulate or break an individual's will. The operation continued in secret until the early 1970s, when public investigations into intelligence agencies began to shed light on their abuses. The Watergate scandal was a major catalyst, prompting Congress to investigate the CIA's activities. The Church Committee hearings of 1975 uncovered the full extent of MKULTRA and its sub-projects. Much of the documentation had been destroyed by Gottlieb in 1973 to protect the operation's secrecy, but enough survived to paint a horrific picture. Whistleblowers came forward, revealing the true nature of the CIA's actions and the damage done to countless innocent people. Among the revelations were stories of terminal cancer patients, mental hospital inmates, and even ordinary citizens who were subjected to these cruel experiments. Some had suffered permanent psychological damage, while others had died as a result of the tests. One of the most tragic stories was that of Frank Olson, a biochemist working for the CIA. Olson was unknowingly dosed with LSD during a retreat, and 9 days later, he fell to his death from a hotel window. The CIA initially claimed it was suicide, but Olson's family believed otherwise. Years later, evidence suggested foul play, including a second autopsy that revealed signs of blunt force trauma before Olson's fall. The revelations were damning, and Operation Midnight Climax was just one small part of the larger horrific story of MKULTRA. It encapsulated the moral rot at the heart of the operation, a desire for dominance and control that disregarded human dignity and safety. The legacy of these experiments remains a dark stain on the history of the CIA, one that continues to raise questions about the ethics of government power and the lengths to which those in authority will go to maintain control over society. The victims of Operation Midnight Climax were forgotten for years, but their stories are now part of a much larger conversation about the risks of unchecked government power and the lengths to which a state might go in the pursuit of absolute control. The story of Operation Midnight Climax begins in 1953, at the dawn of an era defined by paranoia, secrecy, and the relentless pursuit of power. It was a time when the Cold War loomed large over the globe, when the CIA's covert operations were fueled by the need to outmaneuver the Soviet Union and protect the interests of the United States at any cost. In this environment, where moral boundaries were often blurred, the CIA launched one of its most notorious and ethically corrupt initiatives, Operation Midnight Climax. At the helm of this controversial operation was George Hunter White, a man whose career in law enforcement had already set the stage for his eventual involvement in darker corners of the intelligence community. White was a federal narcotics officer who had spent much of his early career immersed in the gritty, dangerous world of drug enforcement. But his transition from public servant to covert operative was not just a career change, it was an ideological shift. White, who had long seen himself as a man who fought fire with fire, believed that to combat crime and espionage, one had to immerse themselves in the same seedy worlds they were trying to dismantle. George White was a man of contradictions. On one hand, he was charming, charismatic, and sharp-tongued, an image of the quintessential mid-century lawman. On the other hand, he was prone to violent outbursts, heavy drinking, and a brutal, often sadistic sense of humor. He was a complicated figure, a man who reveled in his own sense of importance, believing that the country depended on his actions and that the rules he was breaking were justified in the name of national security. This paradox made him the perfect candidate for the covert operations that would define his legacy. As White's career within the CIA progressed, he became more deeply involved in Project MKULTRA, a top-secret initiative launched by the CIA in the early 1950s to explore mind control, behavioral manipulation, and the effects of various drugs on human psychology. MKULTRA's goals were vague, its methods chilling: to find ways to control the minds of individuals, extract secrets, and neutralize enemies of the state. White's involvement with MKULTRA would lead him to orchestrate one of the most horrific and morally bankrupt experiments in the history of the agency: Operation Midnight Climax. Operation Midnight Climax was conceived as an experiment in psychological manipulation, combining the effects of mind-altering substances with sexual provocation. The idea was simple, yet deeply disturbing. If LSD could be used to break down the walls of a subject's mind, if a person could be pushed into a state of psychological disarray through drugs, sex, and manipulation, then the CIA could use this technique to gather intelligence, interrogate spies, and control people's behavior without their knowledge or consent. White's ambitions for Operation Midnight Climax were as grandiose as they were dangerous. The operation was conceived as a way to test the limits of human psychology, to see how far the CIA could push individuals before they broke. And while LSD was the central tool of the experiment, the operation also relied heavily on another weapon: sex. White believed that the combination of LSD and sexual manipulation could create the perfect environment for intelligence gathering. He knew that when people were under the influence of LSD, their inhibitions would be lowered, and their minds would be more susceptible to suggestion. He also understood that sex, especially when it involved vulnerability and manipulation, could serve as a powerful psychological tool. Together, these elements would form the core of Operation Midnight Climax. White's first safe house was set up in San Francisco's Telegraph Hill neighborhood, a bohemian enclave known for its tolerance of vice. The apartment was deceptively normal on the outside, furniture arranged tastefully, soft lighting, music playing in the background. But behind the scenes, it was a carefully constructed trap. Two-way mirrors and hidden cameras allowed CIA operatives to watch the subjects without their knowledge. The apartment became a theater, where the subjects played their roles unwittingly, and the CIA's operatives watched from behind the glass. To facilitate the experiments, White enlisted prostitutes, many of whom were vulnerable women who were either coerced into the operation or saw it as a means of survival. These women were trained not only in the art of seduction, but in the administration of LSD. They were taught how to slip the drug into their clients' drinks, food, and even cigarettes, ensuring that the subjects would ingest the drug without ever realizing it. The women were instructed to manipulate their subjects, to get them to talk, to lower their inhibitions, and to guide them into a psychological freefall. Some women were fully aware of their role in this dark operation, while others were kept in the dark, never told the true nature of the experiments they were participating in. The subjects themselves were ordinary men, salesmen, workers, drifters, and even criminals who were carefully selected by the CIA because they were unlikely to ever report the strange events that unfolded in these safe houses. The CIA targeted men from society's margins, knowing that they would have little recourse if they were harmed. The agency's internal memos referred to these individuals as subjects, stripping them of their humanity in the same way that the operation stripped them of their agency. Once these men were dosed with LSD, They experienced profound psychological effects. Hallucinations were common, with subjects reporting walls that appeared to breathe, lights that seemed to pulse with life, and voices that echoed in their minds. Some men laughed uncontrollably, while others became deeply distressed, convinced that they were dying or being hunted. The CIA's operatives behind the mirrors took meticulous notes, documenting every outburst, every breakdown, and every strange physical or emotional reaction. The CIA's goals were not just to observe these effects, but to manipulate them. They sought to determine if LSD could be used as a tool for interrogation, as a way of breaking down an individual's defenses and getting them to reveal secrets they would never otherwise share. Could sexual manipulation and drug-induced states create an environment in which even the most resistant subject would crumble? These were the questions that haunted White and his colleagues as they pushed forward with the operation. By 1954, Operation Midnight Climax had expanded to a second safe house in New York's Greenwich Village, an area known for its vibrant nightlife and a constant influx of strangers. The operation grew more elaborate as more prostitutes were recruited, more safe houses were set up, and the CIA's experimentation escalated. The agency began testing more extreme scenarios, drugging subjects, and then staging cult-like psychological manipulations to see if individuals could be convinced to change their beliefs or behaviors under the influence of LSD. The operation took on an almost surreal quality, as the CIA tested new ways to manipulate and control the minds of the unsuspecting victims. As the operation grew, so did White's erratic behavior. He became increasingly volatile, relying on alcohol to fuel his actions. He treated the safe houses like playgrounds, inviting colleagues and acquaintances to watch the experiments, often turning them into voyeuristic spectacles. White's obsession with the operation bordered on the sadistic, as he reveled in watching the breakdowns of his subjects. His personal notes, which were often more emotional than scientific, reflect his growing obsession with the power he wielded. He saw himself as a kind of patriot, a man who was willing to do whatever it took to protect the country, regardless of the human cost. However, as the 1960s dawned, LSD began to emerge from the shadows. The counterculture movement, fueled by figures like Timothy Leary, began embracing the drug as a tool for self-discovery and rebellion. Public awareness of LSD grew, and the very drug that had been a state secret began to leak into mainstream culture. For the CIA, this posed a serious problem. If LSD was no longer an obscure tool, its secret use in covert operations could no longer be hidden. In response, Operation Midnight Climax became more precarious. The scrutiny within the CIA grew, as it became increasingly clear that the agency's sub-projects under MKULTRA were engaging in widespread abuse. The once hidden nature of the operation could no longer be sustained. With LSD now under public attention, the CIA's own internal investigation into its activities began to intensify. As the operation grew in scope, so did its consequences. The use of LSD on unwitting subjects escalated, and the ethical dilemmas multiplied. The line between science and exploitation blurred further, leaving behind a trail of broken minds and betrayed trust. The public, at least the small portion that would ever learn of it, was horrified. But for those within the CIA and its intelligence network, Operation Midnight Climax was just one facet of the larger and more disturbing landscape of experimentation under Project MKULTRA. By the late 1950s, some members of the scientific community had begun questioning the safety of these experiments. LSD's effects on the human mind, once seen as a mere curiosity for government research, began to take a more dangerous turn. Despite this, the CIA pushed forward, using more extreme measures to probe the limits of mind control and manipulation. While many within the intelligence community were uneasy about what Operation Midnight Climax had become, the operation's continued success in gathering intelligence was hard to ignore. There was something intoxicating about the power they wielded over their subjects, people who could be reduced to their most primal, vulnerable selves with a drug and the right environment. And with George Hunter White at the helm, the operation continued to operate with impunity, growing ever more complex in its reach and execution. It wasn't until the early 1960s that the first cracks in the program's facade began to appear. Public opinion was shifting rapidly, with the civil rights movement gaining traction and increasing awareness of human rights abuses within the U.S. government. The burgeoning counterculture movement led by the likes of Timothy Leary was not only advocating for the decriminalization of psychedelic drugs, but also challenging the very institutions that were secretly conducting these experiments. The fact that LSD was becoming more widely known and more easily accessible made the covert operations of the CIA even more precarious. The agency, in turn, was faced with the dilemma of continuing to test the limits of mind control or adapting to the cultural shift that was sweeping the nation. Internally, MKULTRA had already begun facing increased scrutiny from higher-ups within the government. Reports had surfaced from other CIA projects that echoed the abuses seen in Operation Midnight Climax. Electroshock therapy, sensory deprivation, and other inhumane tactics had been employed on individuals without their knowledge or consent, raising alarms among some of the more cautious members of the intelligence community. By 1965, the first public signs of internal dissatisfaction were evident. However, it was too late for George White to rein in the damage. The operation's scope was simply too vast, and its consequences too far-reaching. In 1965, Operation Midnight Climax was officially shut down. The safehouses were stripped of their equipment, and the CIA began dismantling its network of agents, including the prostitutes who had been so crucial to the operation's success. Yet for all the destruction of evidence and removal of personnel, the scars left by the program would never be erased. Some of those involved would carry the psychological trauma for years, while others, those who had never been aware of the depths of the program, were left in a state of confusion and betrayal. The lasting impact of the operation would resonate within the intelligence community for decades to come. Despite the program's closure, the aftershocks were felt throughout the agency and the American public. In 1966, the Church Committee was established to investigate the CIA's activities, including the MKULTRA program and its sub-projects. Led by Senator Frank Church, the committee sought to uncover the full extent of the CIA's illegal and unethical behavior, especially in regard to the manipulation of drugs and individuals for intelligence purposes. The committee's investigation would reveal the staggering breadth of MKULTRA's operations, including Operation Midnight Climax. As the public learned of the horrors conducted in secret, there was a mixture of disbelief, anger, and fear. Former victims of the program, those whose lives had been irreparably altered by the experiments, began to come forward. They spoke of their time in the safehouses, the disorienting effects of LSD, and the trauma they had endured. Their testimonies were a chilling account of the human cost of such experiments. Some spoke of the intense paranoia and psychosis they had experienced, while others reported lasting memory loss, depression, and debilitating anxiety. For many, the aftermath was a struggle to regain some sense of normalcy, but the psychological scars were too deep. The revelations of Operation Midnight Climax, coupled with the growing public mistrust of the government, led to a significant loss of confidence in the intelligence community. News outlets picked up the story, and the scandal made its way into the public consciousness. This exposure sparked widespread outrage and led to a series of legal actions against the CIA and its officials. One of the most important legal responses came in the form of lawsuits filed by survivors of the operation. They sought reparations for the harm they had endured. While many of these lawsuits were unsuccessful due to the CIA's ability to claim national security exemptions, they nonetheless highlighted the human rights violations at the heart of the program. Some victims were able to receive compensation in the form of settlements, but the true cost of Operation Midnight Climax could never be quantified in monetary terms. The legal fallout didn't stop there. In 1975, a year after George White's death, President Gerald Ford appointed a commission to investigate the CIA's activities during the 1950s and 1960s. This commission, known as the Rockefeller Commission, conducted a thorough review of MKULTRA and its various sub-projects. Its findings were damning. The commission concluded that the CIA's actions had violated both American law and international human rights standards. It made recommendations for greater oversight of intelligence agencies and called for reforms to prevent similar abuses in the future. Despite the government's acknowledgement of wrongdoing, many felt that the penalties for those involved in Operation Midnight Climax were insufficient. White, who had been at the center of the operation, was never held accountable for his actions. His flamboyant lifestyle and dangerous experimentation left a legacy that the public was forced to reckon with, but his personal responsibility for the suffering caused remained largely unaddressed. The legacy of Operation Midnight Climax also led to lasting reforms in government oversight and intelligence operations. The Church Committee's revelations sparked a push for more stringent oversight of the CIA and other intelligence agencies. Legislative measures were introduced to ensure that any research involving human subjects would require informed consent. The passing of these laws would mark a turning point in the ethical guidelines for intelligence operations and government research. While the operation was officially ended, and much of the documentation was destroyed or concealed, the public's awareness of the CIA's covert activities left an indelible mark on American society. Operation Midnight Climax remains one of the darkest chapters in the history of U.S. intelligence operations, a stark reminder of the lengths to which the government was willing to go in its pursuit of power and control. Its long-lasting effects on both the individuals involved and the nation as a whole would resonate for generations. As a result of the revelations about MKULTRA and its sub-projects, public trust in the government and its institutions would continue to wane. The American public had witnessed firsthand the dangerous intersection of secrecy, science, and unchecked power. Though the formal operations of MKULTRA were dismantled, the lessons learned from its existence remain an essential part of the national conversation about the limits of government authority and the protection of human rights. Let's pause the timeline to meet the people caught in this web. Operation Midnight Climax wasn't just a collection of files, covert budgets, and shadowy rooms. It was built on people. Flawed, frightened, ambitious, and vulnerable people. To understand the depth of its moral decay, we need to look beyond headlines and into the lives of those entangled in its machinery. First, there's George Hunter White, the operation's ringmaster. White was a paradox, a lawman who broke laws, a patriot who betrayed his countrymen. Born in 1906 in Los Angeles, White spent much of his early career as an agent for the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. He cut his teeth chasing opium traffickers through back alleys and foreign ports, building a reputation as both dogged and unconventional. He relished danger and ambiguity. When the CIA came calling in the early 1950s, White didn't hesitate. He moved fluidly from narcotics to espionage, trading badges for safehouse keys. In his world, legality was secondary to results. Covert work gave White the adrenaline fix he craved and the autonomy he desired. He bragged in a letter to Sidney Gottlieb, MKUltra's infamous mastermind, "I'm having the time of my life." And by all accounts, he was. He filled his safehouses with expensive furniture, exotic drinks, surveillance gear, and prostitutes. White was a man who enjoyed control over spaces, operations, and people. But he wasn't a cartoon villain. He didn't cackle in the shadows or twirl a mustache. He believed fervently that he was defending the country from an existential communist threat. For White, the Cold War wasn't abstract. It was real, personal, and worth any sacrifice. The ends justified any means. Yet beneath that rationale lurked personal demons, alcoholism, an explosive temper, and an inflated sense of self. CIA colleagues noted his erratic behavior. One agent later recalled how White drank heavily during surveillance sessions, often turning experiments into twisted social gatherings. He blurred the lines between work and entertainment. He invited friends from the Bureau of Narcotics to observe drugged subjects through one-way mirrors. He shared war stories over martinis while watching terrified men hallucinate. White's operations didn't just test LSD, they tested the limits of human cruelty under the guise of science. Then there's Sarah, a pseudonym for one of the prostitutes who worked the safehouses. Sarah was in her early 20s, a single mother scraping by in San Francisco's underbelly. Recruited by White, she saw the CIA's money as a lifeline. Sex work, especially in the 1950s, came with daily danger and stigma. But this gig was different. It was steady, better paid, and involved high-profile protection. Sarah wasn't naive. She knew the government was using her, but she also believed she was helping protect the country. That's what White told her. That's what she needed to believe. She was charming, quick-witted, and adept at keeping men distracted while slipping LSD into their drinks. Her job was to lure, disarm, and observe. She learned to read body language, to coax out confessions and reactions, all while playing the role of a temptress. But the work took a psychological toll. Sarah later told investigators that she felt complicit, haunted by the men's reactions, some terrified, others shattered. One night in 1958, she watched a man curl into the corner of the room, sobbing uncontrollably after seeing spiders crawl across the ceiling. Another begged for forgiveness from long-dead relatives, trembling and sweating under the drug's weight. Sarah wasn't trained to handle trauma, only to induce it. She began drinking to numb the guilt, drifting into depression. By 1960, she'd had enough. She left the operation swearing never to speak of it again. Her silence was born of shame, not loyalty. She went back to conventional sex work, poorer, but somehow freer. Years later, during the church committee investigations, she gave anonymous testimony, describing the psychological whiplash of working for a government that paid her to damage people. "I wasn't a spy," she reportedly said. "I was bait." And finally, there's John Doe, our stand-in for the countless unnamed victims. Let's imagine John as a 35-year-old insurance salesman, married with 2 kids, in San Francisco for a conference. He was from Omaha, a man who wore neatly pressed shirts and carried a photo of his children in his wallet. One night in 1957, lonely and curious, he wandered into a bar on Telegraph Hill. A woman, attractive, warm, confident, offered him a drink. He accepted. Hours later, he was stumbling down Lombard Street, his mind fractured by visions he couldn't explain. Buildings twisted like paper, voices whispered from shadows, colors bled together. He felt as if he were dying, and worse, as if he were watching himself die. He never learned the truth. He returned to Omaha changed. He grew distant from his wife. He stopped attending his children's school events. He was plagued by nightmares, haunted by flashes of something he couldn't name. Therapy was taboo for men like him in the 1950s. He drank. He withdrew. His marriage dissolved quietly. He lived a half-life, never understanding that he had been a subject in a government experiment. John's story is a reconstruction, a mosaic of dozens of declassified reports and interviews. His name may be fictional, but his experience was real. Hundreds of men like John passed through those safe houses, used and discarded like lab rats. Most never knew they'd been part of an experiment. Some ended up institutionalized. Others took their own lives. Their suffering was classified for decades. There was also Michael, a 28-year-old dock worker with a history of anxiety. He was targeted one evening outside a jazz club. After being lured into a CIA-controlled apartment, he was given a drink and dosed. The experience pushed him over the edge. He reported seeing his dead brother, reliving his father's funeral, and feeling his own skin peel away. 2 weeks later, he checked himself into a psychiatric hospital. The diagnosis was acute psychotic break. His doctors never knew about the LSD. Michael spent the next 10 years in and out of institutions. Or consider Thomas, a Korean War veteran suffering from mild PTSD. He was targeted because the agency wanted to test how LSD affected people with existing trauma. After being dosed, Thomas reportedly tried to jump out of a third-story window. He survived, but the CIA considered the experiment a success. They'd learned that LSD could trigger disorientation in subjects with prior psychological wounds. The cost was just one more broken mind. Even the CIA operatives weren't immune. Several agents who worked under White later reported substance abuse and moral conflict. One junior analyst quit the agency in 1962 after a breakdown. "I couldn't look at myself in the mirror," he wrote in a letter to a friend. "We were playing God in a whorehouse." The tragedy of Operation Midnight Climax wasn't just the LSD or the surveillance. It was the institutional willingness to dehumanize. White believed he was defending freedom. Sarah believed she was surviving. John, Michael, Thomas, they never had a chance to believe anything. They were never told. What makes this story endure is not just its horror, but its humanity. It shows how good people can become instruments of harm when fear, secrecy, and ideology replace empathy. The operation was a tangle of ambition, coercion, loyalty, and silence. And in the middle stood real people, lonely men, desperate women, proud agents, each just trying to navigate their lives. George Hunter White wanted glory. Sarah wanted stability. John wanted a night out. What they got was history, dark and buried for decades. In 1975, when the Church Committee uncovered MKULTRA and Operation Midnight Climax, the nation was stunned. But the people most affected, those like Sarah and John, were largely absent from the hearings. Their voices had been erased by classified files, redacted reports, and institutional amnesia. George Hunter White died in 1975, the same year the program was publicly revealed. He left behind journals, letters, and conflicting accounts. Some portray him as a war hero, others see a sociopath. The truth, like the man, was likely a contradiction. Sarah disappeared from public view. Her testimony remains sealed in archives. And John? We'll never know who he was, but we know he existed. Operation Midnight Climax reminds us that history isn't written only by generals or presidents. It's shaped by the anonymous, the exploited, the forgotten, and their stories deserve to be told. When Operation Midnight Climax ended in 1965, it didn't conclude with public trials or solemn admissions of guilt. Instead, it dissolved in silence, swept under the rug by an agency adept at burying its secrets. The CIA did what it had always done when a project outlived its usefulness or became too toxic to maintain. It covered its tracks. Internal memos were shredded. Safehouses were decommissioned and scrubbed clean, and the paper trail documenting years of covert experimentation was either lost or deliberately destroyed. What remained were fragments, redacted reports, whispered testimonies, and the occasional off-the-record admission. The agency closed the door and moved on. Most of the American public had no idea the project ever existed. George Hunter White, the flamboyant agent who ran the operation like a personal playground, retired quietly to Florida. He never publicly apologized or acknowledged the moral implications of what he'd done. In fact, he remained unrepentant until his death in 1975, referring to his work in clandestine intelligence as a necessary evil and a service to his country. He once wrote, "I was a soldier. I was doing my duty." To the end, White maintained the belief that the ends justified the means, that the Cold War's stakes demanded unconventional, even brutal, strategies. But history has judged him less kindly. What was once portrayed as bold experimentation now reads more like sadistic theater, cloaked in the language of national security. Sidney Gottlieb, the mastermind behind MKULTRA and a key figure in sanctioning Operation Midnight Climax, fared similarly well, at least institutionally. He faced congressional scrutiny during the Church Committee hearings in 1975, a historic investigation into widespread intelligence abuses. Gottlieb testified before lawmakers, but by then, much of the damning evidence was gone. Without concrete records, his involvement was difficult to prosecute. Despite his central role in one of the most ethically bankrupt operations in CIA history, he avoided serious consequences. No prison sentence, no public apology, just retirement, and later, death in relative obscurity. The prostitutes, women like the pseudonymous Sarah, were among the most overlooked figures in this story. They had no official titles, no benefits, no protections. The agency saw them as tools useful in their anonymity and expendable when the operation ended. Sarah, who had worked tirelessly to support her child while under the thumb of White and the CIA, was left to rebuild her life without acknowledgement. Her name never appeared in the declassified reports. She received no support or compensation. For many of these women, the psychological burden lingered long after the work ended. They were haunted not only by what they witnessed, but also by the knowledge that they had been used not just by the men in the rooms, but by their government. And then, there were the victims, the men who unknowingly ingested LSD and suffered its unpredictable effects. They had no idea they were test subjects in a covert operation. To them, the experience was often traumatic, confusing, or humiliating. Many never told anyone what had happened, fearing they wouldn't be believed or ashamed of what they couldn't explain. Some were never the same again. They returned to their homes and jobs, burdened by psychological scars, persistent anxiety, vivid hallucinations, or a creeping paranoia that followed them for years. The CIA referred to them clinically as subjects, but they were human beings, fathers, brothers, workers, dreamers whose lives were derailed in the name of Cold War experimentation. They became collateral damage in a war they didn't even know they were fighting. The Church Committee's revelations in 1975 were a turning point. For the first time, the American public learned the scale of MKULTRA's abuses. Operation Midnight Climax, with its lurid details of LSD-laced drinks, mirrored brothels, and psychological manipulation, was especially shocking. It wasn't just the act of experimentation that drew outrage. It was the utter disregard for consent, the flagrant violation of civil liberties, and the way the CIA viewed American citizens as expendable assets in their intelligence games. The scandal shook public trust in government institutions, especially the intelligence community. The hearings spurred a wave of legislative action. Among the most significant outcomes was the Intelligence Oversight Act of 1980, which established permanent oversight committees in both the House and Senate. These committees were designed to monitor the activities of the CIA and other intelligence agencies, ensuring accountability and transparency. It was an attempt to impose checks and balances on agencies that had operated in near-complete secrecy for decades. While imperfect, the act signaled a shift in the public's tolerance for clandestine overreach. In the legal arena, the aftermath of Operation Midnight Climax was complicated. Victims and their families filed lawsuits against the government, seeking compensation for the trauma they endured. Some of these cases, like those involving Frank Olson, a government scientist who died under suspicious circumstances after being dosed with LSD, garnered national attention. Olson's family eventually received a settlement and a rare formal apology from President Gerald Ford. But most victims of Operation Midnight Climax were not so fortunate. Without clear documentation or confirmation, many cases were dismissed or settled quietly. Justice, for most, was elusive. But perhaps the most insidious impact of the operation was cultural and psychological. LSD, once the CIA's chemical weapon of choice, seeped into mainstream consciousness. As news of MKULTRA and Operation Midnight Climax broke, the drug's mystique only grew. By the late 1960s, LSD had become a symbol of the counterculture, embraced by musicians, artists, and political activists. Ironically, the same substance the CIA hoped to weaponize against foreign agents was now being used to fuel a movement that questioned government authority and celebrated expanded consciousness. In a twisted way, the agency had seeded its own public relations nightmare. Moreover, Operation Midnight Climax left behind a moral scar, a chilling reminder of how far a government could go when shielded by secrecy. It forced Americans to reckon with uncomfortable questions. How many rights can be sacrificed in the name of national security? Who determines the ethical boundaries of experimentation? And what happens when the government becomes the very threat it claims to protect against? When Operation Midnight Climax came to an end in 1965, there were no grand public reckonings. The CIA, with its deep institutional experience in handling scandal, took swift and decisive action to bury the operation. Classified documents were shredded, files were hastily redacted, and any trace of involvement from key individuals was erased. White, the operation's central figure, melted back into civilian life with relative ease. He relocated to Florida, where he lived out his final years, largely unrepentant and perhaps even oblivious to the true extent of the damage caused by his actions. He passed away in 1975, leaving behind a legacy of deceit and moral compromise, his role in the operation buried alongside his death. Sidney Gottlieb, the architect of MKULTRA, faced congressional hearings in the mid-1970s as part of a wider investigation into the CIA's covert experiments. Yet, despite the damning nature of the revelations about MKULTRA, Gottlieb managed to avoid any significant legal or professional consequences. His testimony was shrouded in obfuscation, his demeanor one of detached indifference, as though he were discussing an academic experiment rather than real people whose lives had been irrevocably altered. The scandal, while momentarily shaking the public's faith in government institutions, did not lead to any serious repercussions for the officials who had been complicit in the operation. The broader American public was left in shock, but the system, as it often does, weathered the storm. The women involved, such as Sarah, who had been recruited to work as a prostitute in the safehouses, were discarded once the operation was over. There was no support, no acknowledgement of the psychological toll, and certainly no compensation. In fact, many of these women were left in obscurity, their stories erased from official narratives. Sarah herself went on to live a quiet life, but the burden of what she had participated in weighed heavily on her conscience. Her remorse, as expressed in interviews many years later, was palpable. She had been recruited not because she was a willing accomplice, but because she was struggling to make ends meet in a city teeming with poverty and broken dreams. To her, the operation had been an opportunity to escape the clutches of desperation, but the price she paid was far too high. As for the victims of the Operation John Doe, and the countless others who were unsuspectingly dosed with LSD, their lives were irreparably altered. John's story, a fragmentary one drawn from the patchy records and declassified documents, represents a much larger tragedy. He and others like him never learned the truth behind the mind-altering experiences they were subjected to. The emotional and psychological consequences of being unknowingly drugged were profound and long-lasting. Victims like John carried the scars of their experience with them for years, often in silence, as they tried to make sense of the inexplicable events that had altered their lives. It wasn't until 1975, a decade after the operation had been shut down, that Operation Midnight Climax came to light. The Church Committee, formed to investigate the CIA's illegal activities, revealed the full scope of MKULTRA and its various sub-projects, including the shocking details of Midnight Climax. The public reaction was one of outrage, and the revelation sent shockwaves through American society. The details of the operation were both bizarre and disturbing. CIA agents using prostitutes to lure unsuspecting men into safehouses, where they were dosed with LSD without their knowledge, while the agents observed from behind one-way mirrors. The very idea that the US government had carried out such a grotesque experiment on its own citizens was deeply unsettling. The public outcry that followed the release of this information was substantial, and Operation Midnight Climax became the focal point for broader criticism of the CIA and its activities. For many, it was the culmination of years of suspicion and conspiracy theories about the agency's clandestine operations. The revelations confirmed fears that the government was willing to sacrifice its own citizens in the name of national security. The operation, though largely hidden from public view for years, became emblematic of the CIA's abuse of power and its disregard for the rights and well-being of the individuals it was supposed to protect. The exposure of the operation led to a series of legal actions, though the results were largely unsatisfactory for the victims. Lawsuits were filed by some of the men who had been unknowingly drugged, seeking compensation for the psychological and emotional harm they had suffered. However, the legal process was slow and complicated, and the vast majority of these lawsuits were dismissed or settled out of court with minimal compensation. The government's position was one of staunch defense, arguing that the operation had been conducted for national security purposes, and that the individuals involved had no standing to claim damages. The legal battles also highlighted the difficulties in pursuing justice against powerful institutions. The CIA, with its vast resources and legal expertise, was able to mount a defense that overwhelmed the efforts of the victims. The legal system, too, struggled to address the broader ethical issues raised by the operation. Courts were hesitant to challenge the actions of government agencies, especially those related to national security, even when those actions involved clear violations of personal rights and freedoms. Ultimately, the victims of Operation Midnight Climax received little to no redress for the harm they had suffered. In the years following the Church Committee hearings, there was some movement toward stronger oversight of intelligence agencies. The Intelligence Oversight Act of 1980 was one such response to the scandal, seeking to create greater transparency and accountability within the CIA and other intelligence agencies. Yet, for many, these reforms seemed too little, too late. The damage to public trust had already been done, and it would take decades for that trust to begin to recover. One of the most lasting and unexpected impacts of Operation Midnight Climax was its role in the popularization of LSD and its integration into the counterculture of the 1960s. LSD, once a secret tool of the CIA's mind control experiments, became a symbol of rebellion and freedom. What the CIA had intended as a covert experiment in mind control quickly became a cultural phenomenon. By the late 1960s, LSD was embraced by a generation of young people who saw it as a gateway to expanded consciousness, freedom of thought, and a break from the societal norms that they felt were constraining their individuality. The counterculture movement that flourished in the 1960s, with its embrace of psychedelic drugs, rock music, and anti-establishment ideals, was, in part, a reaction to the very forces that had orchestrated Operation Midnight Climax. The government's attempts to control and manipulate the minds of its citizens unintentionally fueled a cultural revolution that rejected those very same authorities. LSD, once a top-secret government tool, became the emblem of a new social order, one that rejected conformity, embraced alternative lifestyles, and questioned the legitimacy of the government and its actions. The revelations about Operation Midnight Climax and MKULTRA had profound long-term consequences for public trust in government institutions. The very idea that the CIA could conduct such an operation without oversight or accountability eroded the confidence that many Americans had in their government. The scandal sowed the seeds of a deep-seated distrust that continues to this day. For generations, Americans would view government agencies, especially intelligence services, with skepticism and suspicion. The belief that powerful institutions could operate with impunity, conducting covert and often unethical operations in the name of national security, became a central theme in the national consciousness. This distrust was not limited to the CIA. It extended to other branches of government as well, leading to a growing culture of cynicism and disillusionment. People began to question not only the motivations of government officials, but also their competence and integrity. The ideal of a government that operated transparently and in the best interests of its citizens seemed more distant than ever before. The legacy of Operation Midnight Climax, in this sense, was not just one of moral and ethical questions, it was also a fundamental shift in the relationship between the government and the governed. At its core, Operation Midnight Climax was about the manipulation and exploitation of human beings for the sake of national security. It raised fundamental ethical questions that we are still grappling with today. When does national security justify harm? Who decides what is expendable in the pursuit of power and control? The operation blurred the lines between right and wrong, legal and illegal, moral and immoral. The very concept of the greater good was tested, as it always is when powerful institutions are given free rein to act in the name of national security. What happens when those in power decide that the ends justify the means? These are the questions that continue to haunt us as we look back on the legacy of Operation Midnight Climax. While the operation itself is a thing of the past, its ethical implications are very much alive. In an age where the balance between national security and individual freedoms is more precarious than ever, the lessons of Midnight Climax remain relevant. It serves as a stark reminder that unchecked power can twist even the most noble intentions into something monstrous. Operation Midnight Climax wasn't a triumph, nor was it a tragedy in the traditional sense. It was a warning about the dangers of government overreach, about the ethical compromises that can occur when secrecy and power collide, a reminder that institutions must be held accountable, and that the line between right and wrong is not always as clear as we would like to believe. It serves as a cautionary tale, urging vigilance in the face of those who would sacrifice the well-being of individuals for the sake of national security. And there you have it, truth seekers, the strange, sordid tale of Operation Midnight Climax, a story steeped in ambition, betrayal, and the human cost of secrecy, one that remains a chilling reminder of the ways power can be abused in the name of national security. The operation may have officially ended in 1965, but its impact has resonated far beyond the Cold War, reverberating into the present day. While the CIA's actions may feel like a relic of a different time, their echoes are still with us, shaping the conversations about government overreach, personal privacy, and accountability that we have today. It's easy to dismiss this as something that belongs to history, something that happened back then, but when we look at the world around us, it's impossible not to draw parallels. Every time we hear of another case of surveillance overreach, or when we witness the erosion of civil liberties in the name of national security, we're reminded of what can happen when no one's watching the watchers. In the age of digital surveillance, where our personal information is collected, analyzed, and sold without our knowledge, the lessons from Operation Midnight Climax still ring true. What happens when the government crosses the line between protecting its citizens and exploiting them? Are we truly free when our lives are being scrutinized by shadowy organizations whose primary allegiance is to their own power? The question lingers. Should the CIA have been held accountable? And just as importantly, are there still secrets buried, waiting to be uncovered? We may never know the full extent of what happened during MKULTRA and its many operations. But one thing is clear: truth is a dangerous thing. It can shake the very foundation of the institutions we trust and expose the ugly truths behind the curtain. Yet, as we continue to learn more, we must ask ourselves, what are we willing to accept in the name of security? How far is too far when it comes to protecting the state at the expense of the people? I want to hear from you. What do you think? Do you believe the CIA should have faced consequences for their role in these covert experiments? Do you think we'll ever learn the full truth of what happened? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Let's keep this conversation alive. Let's not allow history to repeat itself without learning from it. If you enjoyed this deep dive and want to continue exploring untold stories like this one, smash that like button and subscribe to Secrets Unleashed for a new, eye-opening story every week. There's so much more to uncover, and together, we can keep shining a light on the stories that deserve to be told. Share this video with anyone who loves history, true crime, or just a good jaw-dropping tale. Let's spread the word and keep questioning the narratives that have been shaped for us. For more on MKULTRA and the CIA's hidden history, check out our playlist linked in the description below. There's a lot more to unpack about the experiments, the cover-ups, and the people who were left in the dark. If you want to dig deeper, declassified documents are available online. Start with the Church Committee reports. These records, though heavily redacted, provide fascinating insight into the extent of the operation and the people involved. The truth is out there, and it's up to us to find it. We can't let the past remain buried in shadows, and we must continue to ask the hard questions, no matter how uncomfortable they may be. Until next time, keep questioning, keep seeking, and stay unleashed.